thought helping my sister refinance her house would be a simple favor. Instead, it became the moment I realized how far someone in your own family can go when money is involved. And by the time I understood the refinance pressure she was putting on me, it was already tearing my life apart. My name is Melissa. I'm 36 years old, a financial analyst, and until last year, I believed I had a pretty normal family. Not perfect, but normal. I lived about 20 minutes outside Portland in a small townhouse I bought 5 years ago. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine. I worked hard for it. Long hours, careful budgeting, saying no to vacations, and impulsive spending. Stability mattered to me. Probably because growing up, stability was something we never really had. My older sister, Diane, had always been the opposite of me. She lived fast, big ideas, big risks, big emotions. The kind of person who could charm a room in 5 minutes and leave someone else cleaning up the mess later. Still, she was my sister, and when family calls, you don't usually assume the worst. At least, I didn't. The whole thing started one Sunday afternoon when she invited me over for dinner. Her house was beautiful, a large 2-story place in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Hardwood floors, a landscaped backyard, the kind of place that looked like it came straight out of a real estate magazine. She had bought it 3 years earlier with her husband, Mark. At the time, everyone in the family congratulated her. It felt like she had finally figured life out. But that night, something felt off. Dinner was quiet, too quiet. Mark barely spoke. Diane kept refilling my wine glass even when it was already half full. About halfway through the meal, she leaned forward and smiled in that careful way people do when they're about to ask for something big. "Melissa," she said softly, "I wanted to talk to you about something important." I should have recognized the warning signs right there. Instead, I smiled back. "Sure, what's going on?" She exchanged a quick glance with Mark, the kind of look couples share when they've rehearsed a conversation beforehand. Then she said the sentence that started everything. "We're thinking about refinancing the house." I nodded slowly. That didn't sound like a problem. Lots of people refinance when interest rates change. But then she continued, "And we were hoping you might help us with it." I frowned slightly. "Help how?" For a moment, Diane didn't answer. She just folded her hands together on the table. "You have excellent credit," she said finally, "and the bank thinks adding you to the loan would make the refinancing process much easier." That was the first time I felt the weight of it, the subtle refinance pressure behind what sounded like a simple request. I laughed nervously. "You mean cosign?" "Technically, yes," she said quickly, "but it's temporary, just paperwork." Mark finally spoke. "It would really help us out." And that's when I noticed something strange. Neither of them looked relieved after asking. They looked tense, like the decision had already been made, like the financial manipulation had started long before I even sat down at that dinner table. At the time, I didn't understand how deep the family drama would go, or how dangerous that simple request really was. Because once someone starts applying refinance pressure, it rarely stops with just one conversation. And Diane, she wasn't the type of person who accepted no easily. At first, I tried to treat the conversation like a normal financial discussion. After all, I worked in finance. People refinance homes all the time. On paper, there was nothing unusual about it. But something about the way Diane asked stayed with me. That quiet intensity, the rehearsed smiles, the strange tension between her and Mark. It felt less like a request and more like the beginning of refinance pressure. Still, I didn't want to jump to conclusions. "So what exactly is going on?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. Diane exhaled dramatically, like someone finally admitting a secret. "Well, the interest rate on our current mortgage is terrible, and if we refinance now, we could lower our payments by almost $800 a month." $800. That was significant, but it still didn't explain why they needed me. "Why can't you refinance on your own?" I asked. Mark shifted in his chair. His fingers tapped lightly against the table. Diane answered before he could. "The bank said our debt-to-income ratio is a little high right now." A little high. In finance, that phrase usually meant something very different. I leaned back slightly. How high? Diane hesitated. That pause told me everything. Then she forced a smile. Just temporary stuff. Some credit cards, a small business loan Mark took out, nothing major. Mark stared down at his plate. Something inside me tightened, because this was exactly how financial manipulation often begins, not with a lie, but with a carefully softened version of the truth. Okay, I said slowly, but if I co-sign, that loan becomes my responsibility too. Only technically, she said quickly, there's almost no risk. Almost. Another phrase that meant more than it sounded. I took a sip of water and tried to keep the conversation neutral. How much is the mortgage? About $400,000 left, Mark said quietly. I nearly choked. $400,000? That wasn't a favor. That was a life-altering commitment. Diane reached across the table and touched my hand. You wouldn't actually have to pay anything, she said softly. We've never missed a payment. That might have reassured someone else, but I noticed something. She didn't say they couldn't miss payments, just that they hadn't yet. And suddenly the refinance pressure in the room felt heavier. I'd have to think about it, I said carefully. Diane's smile froze. Think about it? It's a big decision, I explained. It affects my credit, my future loans, everything. For a moment, the warmth disappeared from her expression. Then it came back, brighter than before. Of course, she said sweetly, but the shift had already happened. The moment I didn't say yes immediately, the tone of the conversation changed. And that's when the family drama truly began. Over the next few days, the messages started. At first, they sounded innocent. Hey, did you get a chance to think about the refinance? Then, the bank is waiting for our answer. Then, if we miss this window, our rate might go up. Every message carried the same underlying tone, more refinance pressure, more urgency, more subtle guilt. And slowly, I began to realize something uncomfortable. This wasn't just a financial favor. This was financial manipulation wrapped in the language of family loyalty. And Diane knew exactly which emotional buttons to press. Because she didn't just call once, she called 3 times in the same week, each one slightly heavier than the last, each one pushing the refinance pressure a little further, until finally, one night, she said something that made my stomach drop. Melissa, if you don't help us with this refinance, we might lose the house. And suddenly, the family drama wasn't hypothetical anymore. It had become my responsibility. At least, that's what Diane wanted me to believe. The moment Diane said they might lose the house, everything changed. Not because I believed it immediately, but because she knew exactly how to say it, slowly, carefully, like someone dropping a fragile object onto the floor just to watch how it shatters. Lose the house? I repeated. There was a small pause on the phone. Then Diane sighed dramatically. Well, technically not right away, but things are getting tight. Tight. Another soft word hiding a much bigger problem. I closed my eyes and leaned back in my chair. The refinance pressure was starting to feel less like a request and more like a responsibility someone had quietly placed on my shoulders. What exactly is going on with your finances? I asked. She hesitated again. Then she lowered her voice. Mark's business had a slow year. That was the first time she mentioned a real problem, but even then, it didn't feel like the whole truth. How slow? I asked. Well, we had to use some credit cards to keep things moving. Some. Another vague word. In my job, vague numbers were usually a red flag, because people who were comfortable with their finances didn't avoid specifics, they volunteered them. But Diane never did. Instead, she pivoted, smoothly, almost instinctively. Melissa, you have amazing credit, she said. The bank literally told us adding you would make the refinance approval automatic. There it was again, more refinance pressure. Not just emotional this time, but framed like a logical decision, as if I was being unreasonable for hesitating. I still need time to think, I said. Her voice sharpened slightly. How much time? That question bothered me because it wasn't curiosity, it was impatience. Just a few days, I replied. Another pause. Then Diane laughed lightly. Wow, you're really treating this like a business transaction. I didn't answer because the truth was, it was a business transaction, a $400,000 one, and the more she pushed, the more the situation started to look like financial manipulation. The next day, my mom called, which immediately felt strange. My mom rarely involved herself in money conversations between us, but this time she sounded unusually concerned. "Sweetheart," she said gently, "Diane told me about the refinance situation." Of course she did. The family drama was spreading. "It's a complicated decision," I said carefully. "Well, your sister is really stressed," Mom replied. "She said the bank might reject them without you." I leaned against the kitchen counter. So now the story had evolved again. First it was a favor, then it was urgent, now it was survival. Each step layered with more refinance pressure. "Did she tell you why they can't qualify on their own?" I asked. Mom hesitated. "Something about temporary debt." Temporary, that word again. By the end of the week, 3 more relatives had mentioned it, an aunt at a family dinner, a cousin texting me out of nowhere. Even my dad casually asked if I had helped Diane yet. The family drama was no longer subtle. It had become a quiet campaign, and the message was always the same. Why wouldn't you help your own sister? But something still didn't make sense, because if their situation was really that simple, the bank wouldn't need me. Banks love refinancing loans. They don't reject reliable borrowers easily, which meant one thing: Diane wasn't telling me everything. And the more the refinance pressure increased, the more certain I became of that. So instead of giving her an answer, I decided to do something Diane definitely wasn't expecting. I started asking questions, real ones, the kind that make financial manipulation very difficult to hide. Because if someone is pushing you this hard to sign a loan, there's usually a reason they're desperate, and I was about to find out what that reason really was. The next morning, I did something Diane definitely wasn't expecting. I called the bank. Not her bank specifically, just a mortgage officer I'd worked with professionally before, someone I trusted enough to ask general questions without turning the situation into gossip. I explained it carefully. "My sister wants me to co-sign on a refinance, about $400,000 left on the mortgage. They say the bank wants another name on the loan." There was a pause on the line. Then he asked the question that confirmed my suspicions. "Why do they need a co-signer?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out." Another pause. Then he sighed slowly. "Well, most lenders only ask for a co-signer if there's a serious qualification problem." Serious. Not temporary, not minor. Serious. "What kind of problem?" I asked. "Usually credit score, missed payments, or extremely high debt." Each word felt heavier than the last, because none of that matched the story Diane had been telling me. And suddenly the refinance pressure she'd been putting on me started to look very different. Not like a favor, like a lifeline. After I hung up, I stared at my phone for a long time. Part of me still wanted to believe she was just exaggerating, but the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. The vague answers, the urgency, the expanding family drama, and the constant emotional pushes disguised as concern. Classic financial manipulation. I needed more information, so that evening when Diane called again, I didn't avoid the conversation. I leaned into it. "Hey," she said brightly, "have you thought about the refinance?" There it was again, more refinance pressure. "Yeah," I said calmly, "I actually have a few questions." Her tone shifted instantly. "What kind of questions?" "Your credit score, for example." Silence. Then a nervous laugh. Why would that matter? Because banks don't ask for cosigners unless something's wrong. Silence. This one longer. I told you, she finally said. It's just temporary debt. How much debt? I asked. The line went quiet again. I could practically hear her thinking, calculating which version of the truth would keep me cooperative. Finally, she answered, maybe 50,000. Maybe, even that word felt slippery, but something in her voice told me she was still holding back. That's not enough for a bank to require a cosigner. Her patience cracked slightly. Melissa, why are you interrogating me? I'm not, I said. I'm protecting myself. And that's when the conversation changed completely, because Diane stopped pretending. The warmth disappeared from her voice. You know, she said slowly, most sisters wouldn't make this such a big deal. There it was, the emotional pivot. Guilt, loyalty, the same tools people use when financial manipulation stops working through logic. I'm just asking questions, I said. You're acting like I'm trying to scam you. The word hung in the air. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then she exhaled sharply. We're family. That sentence carried more refinance pressure than anything she'd said before. Family, the one word people use when they want you to stop thinking logically. And for a moment, I almost gave in. Because saying no to a stranger is easy, saying no to family feels like betrayal. But something inside me refused to ignore the warning signs anymore. Because if Diane was hiding the real numbers, then the family drama I'd been dragged into was about to get much worse, and I was starting to suspect the truth would be far bigger than $50,000. I just didn't know how big yet, but I was about to find out, in the most uncomfortable way possible. 2 days later, Diane showed up at my townhouse unannounced. I had just finished work and was still sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop open when the doorbell rang. When I opened the door, she was standing there with Mark behind her. Neither of them looked happy. "Can we talk?" she asked. The tone wasn't friendly. It wasn't warm. It was controlled and heavy with refinance pressure. I stepped aside and let them in. Diane walked straight into the living room like she owned the place. Mark stayed near the doorway, his shoulders tense, eyes moving around the room like he didn't want to be part of whatever was about to happen. "We need to clear the air," Diane said. I crossed my arms. "Okay." She didn't sit down. Instead, she looked at me like I had somehow become the difficult one in this situation. "You've been asking a lot of questions about the refinance." "Yes," I said calmly, "because you're asking me to sign a $400,000 loan." "That's exactly what family is supposed to help with," she snapped. There it was again, the emotional hook, the same tactic she'd been using for weeks, turning a financial decision into a loyalty test. Classic financial manipulation. "I'm not saying no," I said. "I just want the full picture." Her jaw tightened. "You already have the full picture." "No," I said quietly. "I don't." For a moment, the room went silent. Then Mark shifted uncomfortably. And that's when I noticed something strange. He looked exhausted, like someone who had been carrying a secret for too long. "Mark," I said gently, "how much debt do you actually have?" Diane turned sharply. "Melissa!" But Mark interrupted her. "About $280,000. The words landed like a brick dropping onto the floor. Diane froze. I felt my stomach twist. $280,000? I repeated. Mark nodded slowly. "Credit cards, business loans, and a personal loan we took out last year." Last year, right around the time they bought the house. Suddenly, everything made sense. The vague answers, the urgency, the constant refinance pressure. Because this wasn't about lowering an interest rate. This was about survival. "You told me 50,000, I said calmly, looking at Diane. Her face hardened. "It's complicated." "No," I said, "it's dishonest." Her eyes flashed. "You're acting like we're criminals." "I'm acting like someone who just discovered the truth." Mark rubbed his face. "The bank already rejected us once," he admitted. Rejected. So the story had changed again. "They said we're over-leveraged, but if someone with strong credit joins the refinance, it changes everything." I felt a slow wave of realization wash over me. They didn't just want help. They needed someone to absorb the risk they had created. Someone with stable finances. Someone responsible. Someone like me. And suddenly the entire family drama looked painfully clear. Diane hadn't invited me to dinner that night to talk. She had invited me to recruit me, to transfer their financial burden onto my life. That's when the breaking point finally arrived. I took a deep breath. "So, if I sign this refinance, and something happens," Diane interrupted immediately. "Nothing will happen." But I finished the sentence anyway. "I become responsible for almost $700,000 of combined debt." Silence filled the room, and for the first time since this whole situation started, the refinance pressure stopped working, because now the truth was finally sitting in the middle of the room, and no amount of financial manipulation could hide it anymore. But Diane wasn't finished yet. In fact, this was the moment she decided to push harder than ever before, and that was the biggest mistake she would make. For a few seconds, no one said anything. The truth was sitting right there between us. $280,000 in debt, a rejected refinance, and weeks of carefully disguised refinance pressure designed to make me say yes before I understood the risk. Diane was the first one to break the silence. "You're exaggerating the situation," she said sharply. I looked at her. "Am I?" "Yes," she snapped. "People co-sign loans all the time. Not ones this big." Her jaw tightened. "You're acting like we're trying to ruin your life." I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. I needed a moment to think, because emotionally, part of me still wanted to help. She was my sister. But logically, the entire situation smelled like financial manipulation. And something else had started to bother me. Not just the debt, but the way Diane handled the entire family drama. The phone calls, the relatives getting involved, the guilt, the urgency. All of it built around increasing the refinance pressure until I felt like saying no would make me the villain. When I walked back into the living room, Diane was watching me impatiently. "Well?" she said. I took a breath. "Okay," I said slowly. Her eyes lit up immediately. "Okay? I'll talk to the bank." For the first time that evening, she smiled. A wide, relieved smile. Mark looked surprised, and maybe even slightly worried, because the moment I said yes to discussing the refinance, something shifted in the room. The refinance pressure disappeared instantly. Diane relaxed back into the couch like someone who had just won a long negotiation. "I knew you'd come around," she said. I nodded politely, but inside, something else had already started forming. Not anger, not revenge, just clarity. Because agreeing to talk to the bank didn't mean I was agreeing to the loan. It meant I was gathering information. And once I started looking at the situation from a professional perspective, the pieces began falling into place quickly. The next morning, I scheduled a meeting with a mortgage advisor. Not Diane's advisor. Mine. Someone who had absolutely no emotional connection to the situation. When I explained everything, he listened quietly. Then he leaned back in his chair. "This is a very dangerous position for you," he said bluntly. "I thought so," I replied. "If you co-sign this refinance, you legally own the debt too. If they miss payments, your credit takes the hit." Exactly what I suspected. "And if they default," he asked, "you could be responsible for the entire loan." The entire loan, nearly $500,000. Suddenly, the financial manipulation felt even more calculated. Because Diane knew my career. She knew I understood credit, loans, risk. Yet she still tried to bury the truth under layers of refinance pressure and emotional guilt. But now the situation had changed, because knowledge removes leverage, and once the family drama lost its emotional control, the power dynamic flipped. By the end of the meeting, my advisor gave me one final piece of advice. If I were you, I would run a full financial background before you even consider signing anything. That suggestion stuck with me, because if Diane had hidden $200,000 in debt, what else wasn't she telling me? That night, I started digging. Public records, business filings, credit risk patterns tied to Mark's company, and within 2 hours, I found something that made my stomach drop, because the debt wasn't the worst part, not even close. And when Diane realized what I had discovered, the family drama was about to explode in a way she never expected. What I found that night changed everything. At first, I thought I had made a mistake, because the numbers didn't make sense. The business records connected to Mark's company showed something very different from the story Diane had been telling everyone. It wasn't just debt. The company had been operating at a loss for almost 2 years. Not a small loss, a serious one. I stared at the screen, scrolling through the filings again. Loan restructures, late vendor payments, 2 separate liens filed by suppliers, and one line that made my stomach drop. A pending legal claim from a contractor who said Mark's company hadn't paid a 6-figure invoice. Suddenly, the refinance pressure made perfect sense. This wasn't about lowering their mortgage payment. This was about trying to plug a financial hole that was getting bigger every month. And if I signed that refinance, I wouldn't just be helping them, I would be anchoring myself to a sinking ship. The next day, Diane called again. Her voice was unusually cheerful. "So," she said, "did you talk to the bank?" "I did." "And?" I paused. "I need to ask you something first." Her tone shifted slightly. "What? Is Mark's company being sued?" Silence. The kind of silence that answers a question before anyone speaks. Then she laughed nervously. "It's nothing serious. 6 figures doesn't sound small." Another pause. Then the defensiveness arrived instantly. "Why are you digging into our business?" "Because you asked me to sign $500,000 of debt, but I didn't say that. Instead, I asked the question that mattered most. If I sign this refinance, will that money be used to cover the company losses?" She didn't answer right away, and that was all the confirmation I needed. The entire situation had been financial manipulation from the beginning. Not just desperation, strategy. Because if they refinanced successfully with my credit attached, they could pull equity from the house, equity that would quietly disappear into Mark's failing company. And if the business collapsed, the mortgage would still exist, with my name on it. The more I thought about it, the clearer the family drama became. Diane wasn't asking for help. She was asking me to absorb the fallout of decisions she and Mark had made. And suddenly, the weeks of refinance pressure felt less like persuasion and more like a setup. So I made a decision. I told her I would attend one final meeting with the bank, together. She sounded relieved immediately. "I knew you'd come around," she said again. But the meeting didn't go the way she expected. Because when the loan officer started reviewing the refinance documents, he asked a question Diane clearly hadn't prepared for. "Melissa," he said, looking at me, "are you aware of the additional liabilities tied to this property?" Diane's smile froze. "Additional liabilities?" I asked calmly. The loan officer glanced at the paperwork. "There are several active financial disclosures connected to the borrower," he said carefully. Diane tried to interrupt. "We already explained the situation," but the loan officer held up a hand politely. "I understand, but if Melissa is considering joining this refinance, she needs to be aware of all financial risk tied to the property." For the first time since this entire situation began, the refinance pressure disappeared completely. Because when everything is written in official documents, there's no room left for emotional persuasion. The numbers speak for themselves. He continued, "There are outstanding business liabilities, 2 unresolved liens, and a pending legal dispute.
If a cosigner joins the refinance, those risks must be considered when evaluating the stability of the loan. Diane's face went pale, Mark stared down at the table, and suddenly the weeks of financial manipulation collapsed under the weight of reality. I didn't feel triumphant, I didn't feel angry. Mostly, I felt something closer to relief, because the truth had finally stepped into the room, and once the truth appears, even the most intense family drama starts losing its power. The loan officer turned to me. "Do you still want to proceed as a cosigner?" The question hung in the air. For a moment, Diane looked at me desperately. The confidence she'd carried for weeks was gone. Now there was only fear. But I also remembered the dinner conversation, the phone calls, the way relatives had been pulled into the family drama to increase the refinance pressure, the way important information had been hidden until the last possible moment. That wasn't how someone treats a person they're trying to protect. That was how someone treats a person they're trying to use. I took a slow breath. "No," I said, just one word, but it felt like the first honest moment in weeks. Diane stared at me like she didn't recognize me anymore. "You're seriously walking away from this?" she whispered. "I'm walking away from a financial decision that could destroy my future." The loan officer nodded quietly. No one argued after that. The meeting ended quickly. Diane and Mark left the building ahead of me without saying goodbye, and strangely, I didn't chase after them. For most of my life, I believed family meant unconditional loyalty, that helping each other was automatic, but this situation taught me something important. Support and financial manipulation are not the same thing. Helping someone should never involve hiding the truth or creating relentless refinance pressure until the other person feels trapped. Real support requires honesty and responsibility. A few months later, I heard through relatives that Diane and Mark eventually sold the house. It wasn't the outcome they wanted, but it solved the debts they had been trying to hide. As for me, my life returned to something much quieter. My credit remained intact, my finances stayed stable, and the family drama slowly faded into distance. I still care about my sister, but I also learned something I wish more people understood. Sometimes the most loving thing you can say to someone is no, because protecting your future isn't selfish, it's necessary. And sometimes I still wonder about that night at the dinner table when this whole situation began. If you had been sitting where I was, with the same refinance pressure, the same family expectations, and the same hidden risks, what would you have done?